Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar on the Judiciary, the Rule of Law and Civil Justice in Ukraine, a judicial perspective, sponsored by the Law and Economics Center at George Mason University's Antonin Scalia Law School. I'm Kochan. I'm on the faculty at Scalia Law and also serve as the Deputy Executive Director of the Law and Economics Center. This webinar is designed around the mission of the LEC to serve as a nexus for academic research and education that focuses on the timely and relevant economic analysis of legal and public policy issues confronting judges and policymakers nationwide. Our commitment is to developing high quality original law and economics programming and research like the program we have today, to further enhance economic understanding and to provide information that's useful to legal and policy debates surrounding these issues. We thank all of you for joining us to be part of that dialogue. Three federal judges join us today. First, we have Judge David Nuffer, who's a judge on the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah. We also have Judge William Thurman, who's a judge on the U.S. Bankruptcy Court for the District of Utah. And we have Judge Tymkovich, who's the Chief Judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. We're going to get to each of the judges in just a moment, but I want to remind you that if you have a question, please use the Submit Questions Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please identify yourself in the text of your message and keep your questions short so that they can be readily incorporated into this virtual format. We're going to take questions toward the end, so feel free to send those questions in at any time during the programming. Now, before we get started about anything Ukraine specific, I wanted to set the stage and talk to each of these judges a little bit about their experience teaching and being ambassadors for the American judiciary generally. This discussion is against the backdrop of each of these judges having been ambassadors outside in the world, teaching about the rule of law, about ethics, about the ethical and independent judiciary, and why it's critical to the overall system. And so I'm going to ask each of the judges to reflect a little bit about these things generally, and then we'll get right into a discussion about some particulars of their experiences in Ukraine. So Judge Tymkovich, I'd like to start with you, and then I'll turn to each of the other judges for a brief response on this. But what inspired you to teach judges in other countries, and what were the goals in that kind of program?
Well, first of all, Donald, thank you and the Law and Economics Center for sponsoring this event this afternoon. Ukraine obviously is on everybody's mind these days, and the interest in the country and the conflict going on there has really spurred a lot of interest in their government and judicial systems. I came on to the federal bench in 2003, and at a very early point in my career, we started hosting foreign delegations here in Denver, Colorado, where I sit. And we've had delegations from around the world, judges that want to come to this country and better understand the American judicial system, our principles, our ethics, our modes of operation. And so that early being a host here in Colorado spurred an interest in colleagues from around the world and the educational opportunities. In 2007, for the first time, I had an opportunity to visit Ukraine, sponsored by the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, a chance to go over there and interact and teach Ukrainian judges as they were emerging into a more modern Western-style judicial system. My primary focus has been on Ukraine since that time. I've had a chance to visit the country 4 times. And you might surmise from my last name, it has a sort of a Slavic-sounding appeal to it, and it's true. My great-grandfather emigrated from a small village near Lviv in Western Ukraine in 1913, and I was told by one of the Ohio senators who voted for me solely for this reason that I was the first Ukrainian American federal judge. So I've got that in my pocket too.
Thanks very much. Judge Thurman, can you let us know a little bit about what inspired you to be involved in this kind of work?
Sure. Mene Podobayatsia. I'm glad to be here. My interest in teaching started as a practitioner, and then when I took the bench in 2001, I volunteered for various programs and presentations because I felt like I wanted to teach and I wanted to give some presentations on the rule of law and other aspects of especially bankruptcy law is what I am. And then I was asked to serve on the United States Code of Conduct Committee, United States Judicial Conference, Judicial Code of Conduct Committee, where we handled and fielded hundreds, if not thousands, of inquiries from judges around the country on ethical questions. And while serving on that committee, an invitation came into our general counsel's office in DC for the administrative office, asking for a volunteer to go to Ukraine. I readily raised my hand and I was selected to go. And that started the sequence of going over there 3 times and visiting with various judges and speaking on ethics. I enjoyed every minute of it. I had to learn Ukrainian laws and their norms and policies, and especially their judicial policies and procedures. And I learned a lot. I enjoyed meeting with the judges offline. There was another judge that I was, or a couple of other judges I spoke on a panel with, but we would meet with the other judges from Ukraine offline during breaks and the like. And I got to have a feel that the judges there really want to do a good job. They want to be ethical. They want to enhance the country's reputation of being ethical and providing fair justice for those who appear before them. For some reason or another, Ukraine has developed a reputation around the world of having a little bit of corruption in the business, the government, and judiciary. So USAID sponsored this program that I attended with the eye towards improving the judicial ethics, drawing from my own experience on the Code of Conduct Committee. I gave examples, but I was careful not to say you got to do it this way because the U.S. does it this way and we're the best in the world. That was not my goal, but to just handle general questions of ethics and give the judge an idea of where they could improve or where they need to address their matters using their own code of judicial of ethics. And we'll come to that here in a minute or two. So that's kind of was my motivation. It's kind of happenstance. I was asked to do these things, and once I got into them, I really enjoyed them.
And Judge Nuffer, what drove you into this service?
I'm having my typical Zoom difficulty of unmuting, so excuse me, Don. I was trying to remember when I knew this question was coming up. I've been involved in teaching rule of law to judges and lawyers and law students for quite a while. And it really started with visits to our court, like Judge Tymkovich described. Delegations would come over and we would host them for a week and try to expose them to our system. Then traveling, I've been to Bahrain, Egypt, Abu Dhabi, Turkey. We were even bringing in Iranian lawyers from Turkey into Turkey and Ukraine. And it just opens your eyes as to what the American judicial system is. So I just wanted to take every opportunity I could to learn more by going and also to teach more. But I've learned a lot about what the rule of law means and about what its absence means.
So that's a great segue into the next question. Wonderful service that all of you are providing to the world's judiciaries through this process. What are you teaching? Tell us a little bit about why the rule of law and an ethical and independent judiciary and fair civil justice are critical, both domestically in those countries, but also for the interrelations of countries throughout the world. Can we start with Judge Tymkovich on that?
Yeah, thanks, Donald. The mission of these programs and my colleagues and I as participants is really to expose judges, especially in the emerging democracies after the fall of the Berlin Wall. These formerly captive nations really had operated under a Soviet system for many years, and all those countries that became independent in 1991 as the wall fell down had to adopt new systems of government and the judiciary. And each of those countries, whether it's the Baltic nations, Poland, Hungary, et cetera, have had various paths towards the current situation. Ukraine, like the other countries, adopted a written constitution in 1992. It has a tripartite form of government: legislature, executive, and judicial branch. And the judicial branch, as Judge Nuffer and Judge Thurman indicated has had its growth, evolution has been in fits and starts. Our more of a Western notion of the rule of law is something that they weren't necessarily directly exposed to in a judiciary that was dominated in a Marxist and communist system. But the principles that we talk about, in which we try to expose them, are really those timeless principles about an independent judiciary that's free from retaliation and interference from the other branches of government. Written laws that are understandable and can be applied neutrally. I think the separation of powers goes with that. Federalism works in our country and could work in other countries depending on their government system. And really the notion that a written constitution that has meaning and applicability and can be enforced by judges is really a key to kind of an effective modern democracy that can enforce norms and produce prosperity for its citizens.
Thank you. Judge Thurman, your thoughts on what substance is being taught, including what is the rule of law in the ethical independent judiciary?
Well, in my opinion, an ethical judiciary and following the rule of law must permeate every society. It must permeate here in the US and every country around the world. In Ukraine, that's no different. It's essential for a cultivation of confidence of the people and the population in what the government has been and what the judiciary is doing. Without that confidence, people lose hope of getting a fair trial, getting a fair hearing, and businesses may struggle in wanting to go to the country such as Ukraine. But I think that's changing a little bit. Credibility of a judge carries on not only on the bench, but it carries over to the judge's individual and off the bench life. The judge, in my opinion, instills confidence in his or her decisions by the way they conduct themselves on and off the bench. You can have the brightest person in the world, like my two colleagues here, issue decisions. And like my two colleagues, their life is impeccable. They have a great ethical reputation. Some of the judges that I met, well, I didn't meet these, but some of the judges I had heard from our sponsor struggled with some of their own judicial ethical standards. And so in order for business to thrive, I think the judiciary has to thrive as well, maybe be a starting point. Because after all, the judiciary is almost the last stop. It has the power to rein in the executive or and interpret the legislative actions. And so that last stop has got to be believable and credible. And with that, I think businesses will flourish. And it was starting to. It was starting to as before the pandemic and before the invasion.
Thank you, Judge Nuffer.
When I think about what the rule of law means, I think it's credibility and reliability, and it extends to everyone in society. And it means the president is subject to the rule of law. The legislative body is subject to the rule of law. Businesses and individuals are subject to the rule of law. Government agencies are subject to the rule of law. And I'm going to speak in a few minutes in a little more depth on the historical and cultural background of Ukraine and its culture that have led to difficulties in having a transparent and reliable rule of law in all three branches of government. And for example, in the judicial arena, random assignment of cases has not been a norm. Publication of decisions has not been the norm. Now, that has changed over the last 5 to 10 years a great deal, but you can see that without those functions, reliability and predictability are not based in the law. They're based in personality, and sometimes they're based in payments to people in authority. So I view the rule of law as the universal expectation that we in the United States have that is simply not shared in all countries. It's not universal in our country, but because there's cultural norms that affect the reliability, predictability, transparency of the rule of law. But I think we expect it, and other countries expect it when they are exposed to it. I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to join together internationally if we can rely on the rule of law.
Thank you very much. And so our audience knows we are going to have one more preliminary question, and then we're going to ask each of the judges to reflect on their experiences in Ukraine specifically. But I do want to set up a little bit more, and each of you mentioned slightly the connection between the rule of law and markets and the facilitation and flow of commerce. How is the rule of law and what you are trying to instill in the judiciary in these systems, including in Ukraine, necessary to facilitate the flow of commerce, to facilitate markets? And why is it, in some ways, as a couple of you have already mentioned, why specifically is it a precondition for the effective operation of those things? So why are these things important from an economic perspective? Judge Tymkovich.
Well, Donald, the framework of the American Republic is, of course, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And if you go back and study the Federalist Papers, in particular, James Madison's essay in Federalist number 10, he talks about the role of a constitution and a judiciary that exists to create the optimal conditions for civil liberties and economic liberties. And so the American judicial system, our three branches of government, were designed to create the best conditions, our framers thought, that would produce freedom and prosperity. And we've had 200 years of experience with our Constitution and its evolution and its imperfections and its strengths. And that leaves us in a good opportunity as ambassadors from America and our experience as judges in our system to go to other countries and talk about what that framework means for those countries. Ukraine came out of independence and frankly hasn't done as well as some of the other countries that emerged from the Soviet Union. Its neighbor Poland had triple the GDP of Ukraine about 10 years ago. And part of the reason for its lagging as an economic center was because of the perception of corruption or the lack of predictability in the enforcement of laws, as Judge Nuffer was talking about. So if you can create the conditions where you have a free, independent, and impartial judiciary, you create a legal framework that allows for capital from around the country and around the world to come into a country, investment, those sorts of things that are really the foundation for economic prosperity, and I would say also create the best optimum environment for a condition of civil liberties. And I think if you look at countries around the world, countries with a strong judiciary have stronger economies, and I think that's part of the lesson that I think I want to promote in these countries. And when we come back to Ukraine, I could really see a change in the economic conditions of that country from my first visit in 2007 until my last visit in 2019.
Thank you very much. Judge Thurman, you had ended your last comments about the importance to the business environment. Any further reflections on the connection between the rule of law and independent judiciary and prosperity? You're muted, Judge.
I got it.
Yep, you're good. Oh, now you're muted again.
Okay.
Now you're good.
Okay. Yeah, there's a little overlap in what I was saying before and this question, but I'll repeat it. There's no question in my mind that an independent judiciary is necessary to facilitate open and free exchange in markets. Simply that confidence builder. Businesses and people need to have confidence in the decision makers of their country, in the country in which they reside. And I believe that there are many judges in Ukraine who want to be ethical and are ethical and deliver great justice. But there are a few that need some help and some course correction. As an illustration of that, I had a call from one of our attendees the other day who has a case pending and wanted to know a little bit about the lay of the land in Ukraine and what I thought about it. I gave him my pitch, or some of the to what I'm giving now, and that there's a potential that his case will end up back in Ukraine or start there, one of the two. And was concerned about how he would be treated and how to get the case there and whether or not there was a basis for having the case transferred to Ukraine. And I try to encourage him. I think that from what I've heard, and we got some update this morning from our people, our friends over in Ukraine for the USAID, that courts are still being held and judicial functions are operational. Some of the judges have donned their uniforms to go fight in the war, but there are many who are staying online, doing their job. Not very many in-person hearings, but they're functioning. And with that, I think it got a deep-seated desire to enhance the reputation of Ukraine. And not when they do that, it'll enhance the business opportunities.
Thank you very much. Judge Nuffer, if you could reflect on that question and then perhaps just go straight into your reflections on your time in Ukraine right after you complete that.
Sure, and I appreciate the information that's been laid out by Judge Tymkovich and Judge Thurman. If we put ourselves in the position of a supplier of goods inside or outside the country, or someone with intellectual property to protect inside or outside the country, or a lender inside or outside the country, or a contractor who is going inside or outside the country, or an investor inside or outside the country. The business people are accustomed to taking risks, but business people in the modern world, the Western world, as we say, are not accustomed to taking rule of law risks. They don't know how to factor that in. And so it renders any investment, transaction, investment, whatever it might be, a little bit uncertain. So rule of law, I think, provides a common context. And I will go right into the slides that I have, if I can bring that up. Let's see. I'm going to have to just shift screens for just a moment, and then we'll get into the presentation. And I apologize for not being as smooth on this as I was in the practice round. Are you able to see my slides, and are they blocked by the
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. So to place Ukraine, it is in the heartland of Eastern and Western Europe. The reason it is where it is politically is because of its geographic location. You see Poland, Hungary, Romania to the west, Belarus and Russia to the east, the Black Sea with the passageway through the Straits of Bosphorus, past Istanbul, down into the Mediterranean, which of course leads to the Suez Canal and the Eastern markets. It is in a remarkably well-positioned location for trade, but it's also in a great location for invasion. There are no mountains on the border of Ukraine except on its southwestern border. So what you have to understand is Ukraine means borderland. The word literally means borderland because it's everybody's border and everybody likes to invade it. The red-haired Rus from Scandinavia came in 882, and since then spread north into what is Russia. The origin was in Kiev, according to the histories I have read, not according to President Putin. But Ukraine's been dominated over the years by the Mongols, who invaded from the east, Poland and Lithuania, who invaded from the west. They had their own independent period with some Cossack government, Ukrainian Cossacks in the 1600s, who actually had their own constitution with 3 branches of government. Then Imperial Russia came in. And for a while, Russia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire split Ukraine in the 1800s. But you see that influence of Russia has been 300 years old, and then Soviet Russia for the 1900s, and then World War II's most fierce battles were fought in Ukraine, again, because there's no logistical physical borders. The Germans would sweep through, the Russians would sweep back, the Germans would sweep through, the Russians would sweep back, and most of Ukraine suffered horrifically. Ukrainian soldiers served in both German and Russian militaries. That's part of what leads to the myth of Nazism in Ukraine today being a dominant power, even though the president's Jewish. But Ukraine finally achieved independence in 1990. But the history of Ukraine is one of domination and insecurity. But most recently, it's been affected by Russian government theory. And these are some principles I've taken from a couple of books. Another great book to read is Robert Massey's Peter the Great. There was no concept of state in historical Russia. The Tsar was the state. His private staff, his family, they were, in effect, the state. They were the power. There was no power residual in the people. There was no independent bureaucracy. That did change a little with Peter the Great, but when it did, it mirrored the autocratic power of the Tsar. That was absolute and unrestrained. And you hear these horrible stories about Russian Tsars, a very arbitrary power. There's a Russian concept of произвол, which is arbitrariness, despotism, tyranny, and mercy, but entirely random. It reminds me of what I view as some people's mistaken concept of the Old Testament God. I don't believe the Old Testament God was that way, but the Tsar was really that way. And you see that in the Russian affiliation and affinity for the leadership of personality. With the Tsar, with Marx and Lenin, with the various leaders that were absolute strongmen, which we see mirrored in the current Russian leadership. The totalitarian regime theory was not a cause for embarrassment or shame under communism. This was an essential goal in the evolution of society toward the establishment of the communist state. That centralization of authority and whatever the ruler said, being the law, was desirable in the view of Russian government theory. And these historical concepts in these three bullets continue in the culture today. There's another bullet I couldn't fit on about the absolute power of fathers in families. Same kind of thing historically. That did change a lot with World War II, which sent men off to war and women into industry and positions of authority. But this is a cultural set of norms, not just a government theory of norms. So some key facts that I would emphasize as you hear us talk about the rule of law in Ukraine. Independence politically does not mean independence from institutions, relationships, culture, history, and shared heritage. World War II, most Ukrainian men were in the Russian army. They suffered more losses than the soldiers of any other country. When I first started going to Ukraine, and you would see widows, World War II widows, who were selling vegetables on the street because that was their only source of income, because the Russian pensions had evaporated. There was no honor for them as World War II veterans' wives. That heritage is very strong. Desovietization did not instantly create financial and governmental infrastructure that's present in our societies. I was so surprised the first time I went to realize banking was a little insecure, investment structures were a little insecure. A lot of kids in law school would tell me they did not want to become lawyers because they didn't want to have to be dishonest, because their impression of the law just fundamentally was you must engage in bribery and deceptive practices. Russia engaged in a very concentrated program of recolonization. So when desovietization occurred, you had, especially in Eastern Ukraine, many Russian people sent in to the coal mines and the steel centers over there, the big industrial centers. And those people have affiliations. I have so many friends who have Russian and Ukrainian ancestors or even spouses It's a very mixed and feeling. And that's the relocation bullet that I was talking about. If you have a society that doesn't depend on the rule of law, there must be a way to get things done. As they said in Jurassic Park, life will find a way. And that way is corrupt practices and often bribery. But as I said, engineered case assignment, engineered secrecy of opinions. It is a function of society. If you're pulled over by a policeman, or if you were 15 years ago, you might expect to be able to offer a bribe on the spot and be on your way. It was just how things were done because nobody's salary was adequate. They were all set by the government and they were not adequate. How are you going to support your family? You have to make some hard choices. And that's what people did. So as you hear this discussion and you think 30 years from independence, why are we still talking about Ukrainian judicial education and the Ukrainian challenges? Remember, it's deep. But as Judge Thurman and Judge Tymkovich said, we have heroic judges in Ukraine who are doing fantastic things. And they are pushing the Ukrainian judiciary to Western ideals. Another huge benefit is the affiliation with EU standards. I'm more concerned about EU affiliation than I am about NATO. The EU standards are marvelous. You haven't spent time in EU standards, which aren't binding, but must be adopted to participate fully in the EU world of commerce. You'll be so impressed. It's a marvelous model that everyone should look to, and Ukraine's going to be looking to it.
Thank you so much, Judge Nuffer. It's critically important that we understand the historical and cultural foundations before we know what can be accomplished and how to do it. Judge Thurman, can you share some of your perspectives on your time in Ukraine and let us know what you think we should understand about the system?
Sure. Well, I had the opportunity of visiting Ukraine at the invitation of USAID. Actually, their satellite office in Ukraine in Kyiv was called New Justice. I went over there the first time just to speak generally to the judges, and they showed me their code of judicial ethics. And in that, there are 20 articles that they use for guiding themselves for ethical conduct, but they're very, very broad. They're based in principle on principles that we have in our 5 canons in the U.S., but they're very broad. And it says that a judge should be good. You know, you can interpret that as, you know, in a lot of different ways. Or the judge should be ethical, and the judge should pay attention to his or her financial condition and their families, without giving specifics as to what they ought to do. But at least they have it. This was developed in 2013 as a result of the push to become more westernized and trying to bring together the cultural and the ethical standards that the Rada, that's the legislature, the Verovna Rada, and most people just call it the Rada. They, along with their other leaders in the executive branch, wanted to improve it. And so they created this code of conduct for the judges to follow. And they tried, but the lack of specificity, I think, is a detriment to that. When they're judges, it was reported to me that there were some judges that participated in nepotism. We've heard that. Some judges would go on social media and tout the significance and importance and veracity of their rulings during and after the trial, which was a little strange. But they did. That was culturally embedded within them. I didn't think that was entirely ethical, and I made a comment about that, or at least a suggestion to the contrary. And there were other situations where the judges may have gone a little bit overboard. As I mentioned, they had the local judges had great power in appointing subordinates and other legal people within their courts, and nepotism was pretty rampant. And then a second trip, I was invited to go to speak to the newly appointed judges of the Anti-Corruption Court. Well, that's an interesting name. The RADA specifically designated it the High Anti-Corruption Court for a reason. They wanted to instill confidence in the people that the government is addressing ethical and problems that were there. And so they called it anti-corruption. That's all it tries. They try civil criminal cases presented by the prosecutors who have brought the case. It actually, the High Court also has concurrent jurisdiction with other courts, but most of the corruption cases are now being brought before the High Court of Anti-Corruption. And so I had a chance to talk to those newly appointed judges, and they were very, very eager to learn their duties. I mean, they hadn't even taken the bench yet. So it was a real opportunity to get in and mix and talk about what their responsibilities were and how they would address them. I gave some hypotheticals and had good dialogue back and forth among us. It was interesting that the judges on the High Court could be selected from defense attorneys, academics, current judges, but no prosecutors. I thought that was an interesting twist. And maybe it was focused on trying to rid themselves of that corruption tagline. Then the third trip, I was invited back to go to the seaport city of Odessa to speak to the Council of Judges. Now, the Council of Judges is the governing body primarily of all the judiciary. There's a Congress of Judges that meets every 2 years to pass on administrative policies and the like, but the Council of Judges basically run the country. And I don't say that derogatorily against the Congress of Judges, but that's just the way it is. The Council of Judges are in session just about all the time. And they address maybe the current needs of the judiciary and ask for permanent approval by the Congress when it meets. As I mentioned, this code that they developed was back in 2013, and it has helped a lot. It has helped a lot. And the judges of the High Court wanted to know what they should do in particular issues, especially in the dealing with the corruption, bribery. Yeah, that was as an issue. That's one of the issues that they tried. I was informed, and I think it's having success. On this report we got this morning from our colleague in Kyiv, David Vaughn, who's the chief of party for the USAID there, indicated that the High Court is still functioning and it's trying those cases, still trying the cases, now on a reduced plane, of course. And so through all those trips and invitations I had, there were wonderful experiences. I learned a lot about the judges, learned about how they would address things, the cultural aspects that are built into them by what Judge Nuffer just mentioned, the centuries of being invaded and having oppression from other outside countries is horrific. And it is, and Ukraine's only been going as a separate country now for several decades, but it's trying to rid itself of those cultural norms that are perceived as corruption and trying to put that over. Get over. Let me mention another thing. USAID is a wonderful organization. They set up satellite offices around the world, and at the request of countries, they're invited in. They receive funding from the direct funding from Congress, and they pair up with the State Department in a number of areas. But they're on the ground, and they're trying to provide programs, humanitarian programs, governmental advice and counsel, and the judiciary. And that's where I came into play, and that's where my colleagues did as well in teaching the rule of law and understanding their norms. But I think USAID has the right idea, and with its continued support, I'm pretty confident that the Ukraine will turn the corner. It's going to take some time. It's not going to be an immediate fix, especially with the war going on. But with the fact that they're continuing to operate tells me that they want to keep the spirit alive of correcting some of the policies and procedures they had and trying to become a more ethical society, and in fact, and particularly the judiciary, which I dealt with Let me just paint a picture. Oh, let's go to that, my next slide, as a map of Ukraine. We show that, well, this is, okay, this one right here. This beautiful picture I took from our place where we held our meetings on top of a hotel in Kyiv. You see how beautiful it is. That was great. Let's go to the next. This is where the insurgency lies. You've seen these maps before on TV. Down here at the bottom, you see Odessa, and you see the city of Mykolaiv. Mykolaiv, what a wonderful city. I didn't make it there, but I heard a lot of good stories and accounts from it. Go to that next slide. This is a picture of the courthouse in Mykolaiv after taking a direct hit from a Russian missile. And it was reported that several of the legal assistants in the building were killed during that. And go back to that picture of Kyiv. Take a picture of that, and then go to the Mykolaiv just for comparison. I hope, next one. I hope that Kyiv doesn't get the same treatment that Mykolaiv has experienced. It's terrible. We're from our colleagues, we're told that 20% of the appellate and trial courts have ceased operations in Kyiv and other cities, but most have successfully removed files in our operation, as I mentioned. 32 courthouses, about 5% were critically damaged, this being one of them. Most of the judges are staying in Ukraine. Territorial jurisdictions have been changed by the Supreme Court. And other organizations are continuing to function. So that's kind of a picture that I had and will remember it for a long time.
Thank you very much, Judge Thurman. And for the final set of opening reflections, Judge Tymkovich, tell us a little bit about your experience there.
Well, I've visited 4 times, as I've said, since 2007. And as I think the images you can see, Ukraine is a gorgeous country. In addition to its unfortunate location between empires, it has one of the richest agricultural conditions in the world. About 30% of the world's wheat exports come from Ukraine. And it has seaports, it has beaches, it has ski areas, it has majestic rivers. So really a gorgeous country. And now, after all the work that my colleagues and I and dozens of other judges from around the country have done to work on rebuilding the country from the Soviet era, it finds itself now back in another war. And because of Ukraine's location, as Judge Nuffer said, it was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1940. It was invaded by the Nazi Germany in 1941. And then after the war ended in 1945, Ukraine, of course, became absorbed into the Soviet Union, including parts of Western Ukraine that were never part of the Russian Empire. The image you see on the shared screen, that's an aerial photo of Lviv, which is a major university city in Western Ukraine. If we'd had this conversation a year ago, I don't think anybody could have found Ukraine on a map without a prompt, but now everybody knows where the country is and its major population centers. Lviv is historically, although it had been part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, has really been a primary focus of the rise of the Ukrainian state and the protection of its national sovereignty. I had a chance to speak at the Rule of Law program at Ukrainian Catholic University, which is located in Lviv. And really, the education system there was really dedicated towards improving the background education ethics of Ukrainian lawyers and judges. And I'll touch on that in a minute. Could we go to the next image, please? Sydney, could we go to the next slide? There we go. I'll go quickly back to World War II. After it was absorbed in the Soviet Empire, Khrushchev actually transferred the Crimean part of the Russian Soviet to Ukraine in 1954. And as Judge Nuffer mentioned, especially in eastern Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula, there's many national Russians that were relocated there during the 30s and 40s and after the war. I think a lot of historians say that the Chernobyl explosion it was one of the critical events. 1988, the corruption and the secrecy that accompanied that led to substantial protests in the Ukraine Republic, and I think other Russians started not believing in the Soviet system. And then, of course, in 1991, the Berlin Wall fell down and the Soviet Union imploded. Could we go to the next slide? That's an image of the aftermath of Chernobyl. Ironically, a month ago or so, the Russian army was back in Chernobyl at that plant. This image is of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1991. Next slide, please. Ukraine since 1991 has had an interesting evolution up to this war. Probably the most significant geopolitical aspect before 2022. After the Ukraine declared its independence in 1990, adopted a constitution. It's little known that it was the third largest nuclear power in the world. Ukraine had over 3,000 nuclear weapons that it inherited from the Soviet Union. To remedy that, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine entered into an agreement that was ratified in a document called the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where Ukraine agreed to give up and dismantle all of its nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees of national sovereignty, including the borders that existed in 1991, and only until 2014, when Russia began its invasion, were those borders violated. Many Ukrainians have told me in my visits there that they wish they would have held back one of those nuclear weapons as an additional deterrent against Russian aggression, and certainly that ironically rings true as we see what's happened since then. Because the Ukrainian economy lagged and its judiciary didn't reach its full potential, you had a lot of frustration over the direction of the country. The Orange Revolution is what was tagged for the really protests that led to the removal of a pro-Russian political candidate and the rise of a more Western-oriented political system. I mentioned the Orange Revolution because the Ukrainian Supreme Court actually issued an opinion that overruled the results of the national election that year and required a second runoff election. And I like to think of that as the Ukrainian judiciary's Marbury versus Madison moment, where it finally realized that an independent judiciary can be a force of good and change and constitutional norms. Could we go to the next slide, please? And the next slide after that, that's the Orange Revolution in Kyiv. In 2013 and 2014, we have the next revolution in Ukraine called the Maidan Revolution. And again, that resulted from kind of Soviet political interference in the Ukrainian political system. And it led to protests in Kyiv over the orientation of the Yanukovych government towards a closer affiliation with Russia, and less of an interest in joining the Western European Economic Union. It led to the deaths of several hundred Ukrainians. Yanukovych fled the country, and a new government was installed. If we go to the next slide, please. You can see some images from the Maidan Revolution. The next slide, please. The import of these revolutions was really the generation of a stronger and more independent judiciary. As I indicated earlier, Ukraine has a kind of a traditional tripartite government structure. You can see on the right the judicial branch. Go to the next slide, please. In 2015 and again in 2019, the Ukrainian Rada, the legislative branch, made substantial changes to the Ukrainian justice system in an effort to combat this actual and the appearance of corruption in the judiciary and strengthen the institution so that Ukraine could continue to grow economically. You can see it's a fairly complex judicial structure, and its Supreme Court, unlike ours with 9, has 189. But don't let that deceive you. The Supreme Court is really more functionally like the United States circuit courts of appeal, and we have about 180 active circuit judges. But you can see they have specialty courts for commercial, administrative, civil, and criminal matters, and sort of different trial courts and different appellate structures. In the lower right, kind of on its side, you can see the high anti-corruption court that was created by legislation in 2019 that Judge Thurman was talking about. And that court is a specialty court that takes on cases that involve high-profile individuals, government officials, and important business officials. And the design was the vision was a separate court that would have a particularly high standard and visibility as non-corrupt and as a place where the Ukrainian people and the international community could see that the justice and the due process were being promoted by this institution. To become a judge on that court takes a particular high level of background investigation, revealing your financial holdings. And believe it or not, after a separate entity nominates judges for the court, there's an international body that has the ability to veto nominees to that court that was established by the Ukrainian government and invited more or less individuals from other countries in Western Europe to have kind of a veto power over judges. So kind of a remarkable structure, something that in our country we find strange, but desperate times lead to desperate measures. And the High Anti-Corruption Court was their response to this perception of corruption. If I go to the next slide, please, and I'll wrap up here in the next one. This is me in 2019 with the Chief Justice of the Ukrainian highest Supreme Court, Justice Donishevsky. She gave me a token of our visit. If I could go to the next slide, please. And that's an image of me in front of St. Sophia Cathedral, which is about to celebrate its thousandth year in the square outside of Kyiv. This is in downtown Kyiv. And those images that Judge Thurman showed of destroyed buildings, I fear and pray that that doesn't become an image here. We go to the next slide, please. Supreme Court Justice Ivan Mishchenko. I think I met him at one of the receptions I attended in 2019. 2 months ago, he's in his black robe and deciding cases. Now he's in his camo fatigues, automatic weapon on the street of Kyiv in the middle of a shooting war. So the previous image of me in St. Sophia was 2 years ago. That was then. This is now. And go to the last image. Vladimir Zelensky a year ago, Vladimir Zelensky today. And it's what it's like to be a wartime president at a time in an active conflict, and a really asymmetrical conflict given the Ukrainians' lack of membership in NATO and the size and ferocity of the Russian invasion. So the challenges of this country are enormous. No one can predict how the conflict's going to unfold. And in the future, we hope that there's going to be an opportunity for American judges to help Ukraine rebuild from its current misery. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for those interesting remarks and backstories. I do want to move to audience questions in just a moment, but if you could each take 60 seconds to tell me, I think you've all been in contact with, or at least observing closely what's happening today. And some of your presentations included a story or two about that. But in sort of 60 seconds, what's the most inspiring, disheartening, informative, or helpful thing that you've learned from communication with people in Ukraine who you've worked with in the past couple of months?
Well, I'll go first. And as Judge Thurman mentioned, the Ukrainian judiciary is still operating against all odds. The courts in all but the Far East are operational or are deciding cases. Many judges and their families have had to flee. The image of the Ukrainian judge, there's a long piece about him in the Atlantic magazine that you can read about. He evacuated his family to Poland and then came back to fight for the homeland. Other USAID people that I interacted with, some are on the streets with weapons, joining the Ukrainian military. Others are in a support role. I had several colleagues that were holed up in Kyiv, and especially at the beginning, I was just terrified for them. My translator, who was with her elderly mother in Kyiv, finally was able to be evacuated to Western Ukraine after a couple of weeks. I was really worried about her ability to survive what looked like a siege in Kyiv. So you have people that are really responding to a national crisis. You wonder how other countries, how we would respond to a similar crisis. I have to say, Donald, that when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, I think a lot of people in Ukraine wondered what it would mean to the Ukrainian statehood, and nothing has further generated Ukrainian nationalism than the Russian invasion in 2014. And they show it on the streets every day now during this war since February. And so we grieve for what's happening there, but we're also inspired by the courage, the resilience, and the willingness to stand up against a worldwide bully at a critical time in Eastern Europe history.
Judge Nuffer or Judge Thurman, any anecdotal reflections?
In the interest of time, Don, I'm going to pass.
Judge Thurman?
I'll just echo what the chief just said. My impression is the indomitable spirit of the Ukrainians. How easy would it have been just to roll over and flee the country and let the chips fall where they are? But they're standing pat, and I'm really amazed at that.
So we have some audience questions. I'd like to turn to a couple of those, and anyone can answer. One is, do you see a role for the courts in prosecuting any war crimes after the war is over?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can't say I'm an expert in that at all, of course, but we do have the example of the Nuremberg trials after World War II. After the Balkans conflict, there were war crimes trials in Europe, and so there are treaties and laws that govern that's the law of war, and certainly to the extent that the Ukrainians are able to develop cases. I don't know what would happen within the country of Ukraine, but there are other European legal institutions that can look at potential war crimes.
Anyone else have a thought on that?
I had heard from our correspondent, David Vaughn, who's the chief of party for New Justice, that the High Court, High Anti-Corruption Court, is investigating and will be trying some war crimes. The prosecutors are gathering information and evidence now for those cases.
There are military courts in Ukraine which might take some of that load.
Interesting. Okay, another question. There's a series of questions that all are around the theme of what's the role of the judiciary in combating disinformation, especially if that disinformation is meant to facilitate corruption and or to allow certain parties to diminish the stature of institutions. And do you have any specific examples from that happening in Ukraine and how the judiciary might react?
Well, I think, I think that's the point of the high anti-corruption court and the reforms that occurred since 2019. I think Ukraine kind of, through some self-awareness, realized that there was a problem, and that that unequal justice, you can call it disinformation, what you have, but they created an institution that was designed to be a bulwark against that kind of conduct. And I think, I think I counted there are like 30 other countries that have these high anti-corruption court models. So it's certainly not unusual in Eastern Europe and around the world. So that's one avenue they took. And I actually saw one of the first trials in 2019 when I was there. Literally the first appellate case, I had a chance to sit in and observe and meet with the justices that were parts of those new anti-corruption courts.
Anyone else on that question? All right, so I think we are just about at time at our hour, but I'd like to ask each of you to leave us with a closing thought about what you think the audience should know about the state of the judiciary in Ukraine today, or what we should be watchful for. And what lesson do you want everyone to walk away with for the afternoon? We'll start with Judge Nuffer.
Resilience of the Ukrainians has been proven to the world. The need to integrate Ukraine into the Western and specifically European community, and the need for long-term attention. We did not do enough when Crimea was invaded, and we're bearing the aftermath of that unfortunate decision. We want to protect the Baltics and Poland, and so we need to continue to take a stand united with Europe and other countries.
Thank you. Judge Thurman.
I just have a couple of Ukrainian words that I want to share and leave with you. Bajahu Vamosbihiv. I wish you all the best, and I wish the Ukrainians all the best in their efforts to stay their country and move ahead.
Thank you, Judge Thurman. Judge Tymkovich.
I couldn't agree more. We're watching a hot war in Europe for the first time since World War II. There's a lot more at stake than simply Ukrainian sovereignty. I think it's a symbol of the rule of law and the ability of a nation to chart its own path. For me, Ukraine was this close to success. I think that the reforms that have been implemented and the leadership of the new political structure and President Zelensky had finally turned the corner for Ukraine. And to see so much of that loss is really disheartening to watch. But I'm rooting for the Ukrainian people, for the Ukrainian military. I agree with Judge Nuffer. If this conflict isn't resolved in Ukraine, it's going to bleed over into Poland and other countries. And just to sum up, there's so many Ukrainian people of Ukrainian descent like me in this country. You'll be happy to know that Milton Friedman and Ludwig von Mises have Ukrainian heritage. Stan Getz, Dustin Hoffman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So Ukraine has certainly enriched the American culture, and it has its own wonderful culture. And I hope that the 5 million refugees are able to go home to an independent country.
Well, it has been an honor having all of you with us. Thank you very much to Judge Tymkovich, to Judge Thurman, and to Judge Nuffer for sharing your perspectives today. Thank you also for your service by sharing your wisdom about these issues throughout the world, and to all the judges who are watching, who are taking on that service. We thank you for it. With that, we will be coming to a close with just a few final remarks. And so let me share my screen. Which does not appear to be. Are we seeing the courthouse in Mykolaiv now? All right. Well, with that, I'm not sure. I'll just say thank you to all of you for being part of this program. To all in our audience. Please do visit masonlec.org. That's masonlec.org to learn more about the Law and Economics Center, to learn about both our in-person programming as well as our upcoming virtual programming. And if you would like to support the LEC's ability to continue offering law and economics focused programming like you view today, along with our robust agenda of additional in-person institutes, seminars, forums, and other formats for state and federal judges, attorneys general and their staff, legislators and their staff, other policymakers and thought leaders of all types, please do consider donating at masonlec.org/donate, which is all at the masonlec.org website. We look forward to seeing all of you again soon at another LEC program. And with that, we will bid you all a great afternoon. Thank you again to all of our panelists, and thank you to our audience.